Alright, my friend, settle in because what I'm about to tell you will absolutely blow your mind. Picture this scene. A dimly lit art studio after hours, the smell of paint and clay hanging heavy in the air. Canvases stacked against walls like forgotten dreams, and in the corner, rolls of packaging materials left over from a recent exhibition. What happens next in this quiet space will change everything you think you know about revenge, about power, and about never judging someone by their silence. This isn't just a story about bullying. This is about awakening something that was never meant to be disturbed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Riverside Community Arts Center in Pine Creek, Oregon. Maya Shun balanced her worn messenger bag against her hip as she pushed through the heavy glass doors, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. At 19, she moved through the world like she was trying not to disturb it, keeping her dark eyes downcast and her voice barely above a whisper. The community center had become her refuge after dropping out of college, a place where she could lose herself in pottery wheels and paint fumes without anyone asking too many questions about why she'd left everything behind. Maya had always been the invisible one. In high school, teachers forgot her name. In college, roommates acted like she wasn't there. Even her own family seemed surprised when she spoke at dinner. But here, in the quiet corners of the art studio, she found something that felt like peace. She'd signed up for evening classes in ceramics and painting, paying with money saved from her weekend job at a local coffee shop. The instructors were kind. The other students mostly kept to themselves, and for the first time in months, Maya felt like she could breathe. What Maya didn't know was that her peaceful sanctuary was about to be invaded. The Riverside Arts Center shared its building with the Pine Creek Youth Athletic League, and 3 members of the women's volleyball team had been using the facility's community room for what they called team bonding sessions. Zoe Blackwell was their unofficial leader, tall and athletic with platinum hair always pulled into a perfect ponytail. She had the kind of confidence that came from winning district championships and being photographed for the local newspaper. Sports section. Her followers, Emma and Jade, worshipped the ground she walked on and treated her every cruel suggestion like gospel. Zoe had noticed Maya weeks ago, the way she skulked around the building like a ghost, never making eye contact, never speaking unless directly addressed. There was something about Maya's timid presence that irritated Zoe on a fundamental level. Maybe it was the way Maya seemed content to be invisible, or maybe it was how she'd seen some of Maya's pottery pieces drying on the studio shelves, delicate and beautiful in a way that made Zoe feel something uncomfortably close to jealousy. Either way, Zoe had decided that Maya Chun was a problem that needed solving. The plan came to Zoe during a particularly boring team meeting about fundraising strategies. They'd been discussing ways to package and ship their handmade crafts for an upcoming charity auction when her eyes fell on the massive rolls of bubble wrap stored in the supply closet. Emma had joked about wrapping someone up like a present, and something clicked in Zoe's mind. Not just wrap someone. Wrap Maya. Show her exactly what she was worth by treating her like the garbage she obviously was. The idea grew in Zoe's imagination, until it became an obsession. She'd make Maya understand that some people were meant to be seen and admired, while others were meant to be packaged up and forgotten. Maya had no idea what was brewing as she settled into her usual evening routine. She'd arrive at 5:30 when most of the day classes were finishing up and the building grew quiet. She'd claim her favorite pottery wheel in the back corner where the light was softest and spend hours working with clay, her hands shaping bowls and vases with a precision that surprised even her. Tonight felt different though. The building seemed emptier than usual, the hallways echoing with an odd stillness that made her skin prickle with unease. As Maya wedged her clay and prepared her workspace, She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She'd caught glimpses of the volleyball girls around the building before, heard their loud laughter echoing from the community room. Down the hall, they existed in a completely different world from hers, bright and confident and taking up space in ways Maya never could. She'd always assumed they barely knew she existed, which was exactly how she preferred it. Attention, in Maya's experience, only led to pain. The pottery wheel hummed to life under her feet, and Maya lost herself in the familiar rhythm of centering the clay. Her hands moved with practiced precision, coaxing the spinning earth into graceful curves. This was her meditation, her escape from a world that always felt too loud and too bright and too demanding. Here, in this quiet corner of the studio, Maya felt something she'd never experienced anywhere else. Not quite confidence, but something close to it. A sense that her hands could create beauty, that her presence could add something valuable to the world instead of just taking up space. What Maya didn't realize was that her quiet sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. Down the hall, Zoe was implementing the final stages of her plan, gathering supplies and coordinating with Emma and Jade. The building's security cameras had convenient blind spots that Zoe had carefully mapped out over the past week. The evening cleaning staff wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. And Maya Chun, predictable as clockwork, would be alone in the pottery studio with nothing but clay and silence for company. The stage was set for something that would change everything, not just for Maya, but for everyone who thought they understood what quiet people were capable of when pushed too far. Maya Chun had learned to disappear long before she ever set foot in the Riverside Arts Center. Growing up in the suburbs of Portland, she'd perfected the art of being overlooked by the time she was 12. Her parents, both software engineers, who communicated primarily through shared Google Calendars and efficiency metrics, had never quite figured out what to do with a daughter who preferred sketching to coding, who cried during family game nights because the competition felt too intense, who would rather spend Saturday afternoons reading in her closet than attending the enrichment activities they'd carefully researched and budgeted for. The Chun household operated like a well-oiled machine, all productivity apps and optimized schedules. Maya's older brother David had slotted perfectly into this system, excelling at debate team and robotics club, accumulating achievements like digital badges in a video game. Maya, on the other hand, felt like a glitch in their family's operating system. She forgot to update her shared calendar, missed deadlines for summer camp applications, and had once spent an entire dinner sitting silently while her family discussed quarterly goal reviews without anyone noticing she hadn't contributed a single word. Her parents weren't cruel, exactly. They loved her in their systematic way, ensuring she had nutritious meals and educational opportunities and regular dental checkups. But love, Maya had learned, could feel a lot like being processed through an algorithm. When she'd shown interest in art during middle school, they dutifully enrolled her in classes and bought her supplies, treating creativity like another skill to be optimized. They'd hung her drawings on the refrigerator with the same efficiency. They used to file tax documents, and Maya had slowly stopped creating anything worth displaying. High school had been a masterclass in invisibility. Maya attended Westbrook Preparatory, a private school where her parents' tech salaries bought her access to excellent teachers and small class sizes, but couldn't purchase the social confidence that seemed to come naturally to her classmates. She'd sit in the back of every classroom, taking meticulous notes and earning solid grades while her peers formed friend groups and inside jokes around her like water flowing around a stone. She wasn't bullied, exactly. She was something worse. She was forgettable. The few times Maya had tried to push past her natural reticence, the results had been disastrous. During sophomore year, she'd worked up the courage to audition for the school play, thinking that maybe having a character to hide behind would make performing easier. She'd practiced her monologue for weeks in her bedroom mirror, but when the moment came, she'd frozen completely, standing silent on the stage while the drama teacher waited and her potential castmates whispered among themselves. The director had kindly suggested she consider working on sets instead, and Maya had spent the rest of the semester painting backdrops in silence while the real actors rehearsed their lines. College was supposed to be different. Maya had chosen Pacific Northwest University specifically because it was large enough for her to disappear into, diverse enough that she might find her tribe among the art students and creative writing majors. She'd moved into a tiny dorm room with a roommate named Jessica, who seemed nice enough during orientation week, answering Maya's tentative questions about class schedules and dining hall hours with genuine friendliness. But as the semester progressed, Maya watched Jessica build a social circle with the same ease that other people learned to ride bicycles. Jessica would invite Maya to join study groups and dinner plans, but Maya's anxiety would spike at the thought of navigating group conversations, of trying to find the right moment to speak without interrupting, of worrying that her contributions weren't interesting enough to justify taking up space. She'd decline with apologetic smiles, and eventually, Jessica stopped asking. The breaking point came during spring semester of her freshman year. Maya had been struggling in her introduction to psychology class, not because the material was difficult, but because participation counted for 20% of the grade. Week after week, she'd sit with her hand partially raised, heart hammering, while more confident students dominated discussions. Professor Williams was known for calling on quiet students, and Maya lived in terror of the moment when his attention would land on her. When it finally happened, Maya's mind had gone completely blank. She'd been following the discussion about cognitive behavioral therapy, had actually prepared several thoughtful questions about the reading assignment, but when Professor Williams said her name and 30 pairs of eyes turned toward her, every coherent thought evaporated. She'd stammered something incoherent about homework deadlines, realized she was making no sense, and then simply stopped talking mid-sentence. The silence stretched until Professor Williams moved on to another student, and Maya had spent the rest of the class period fighting back tears. That night, she'd called her parents and told them she wanted to come home. She'd invented a story about reconsidering her major, about wanting to explore other options before committing to a 4-year program. Her parents, ever practical, had run a cost-benefit analysis and concluded that taking a gap year was financially responsible if it helped her make better long-term decisions. They'd helped her withdraw from classes and move back into her childhood bedroom, treating her return like a strategic pivot rather than a failure. For 6 months, Maya had drifted through her parents' house like a ghost, sleeping until noon, and spending her days in a haze of Netflix and social media scrolling. Her parents had suggested job applications and community college courses with the gentle persistence of people trying to debug a malfunctioning program. Maya had nodded, agreed, and done nothing, paralyzed by the certainty that she would fail at anything she attempted. The coffee shop job had happened by accident. Maya had been walking past Grind Coffee on one of her rare ventures outside the house when she'd noticed a handwritten help wanted sign in the window. Something about the casual, unintimidating nature of the paper taped to the glass had made her pause. Before she could talk herself out of it, she'd pushed through the door and asked about the position. The owner, a middle-aged woman named Carla, with paint-stained fingers and kind eyes, had hired Maya on the spot. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She never competed for the premium clay or the best tools, content to work with whatever materials were left over. She'd learned which students enjoyed giving advice and which preferred to work in solitude, adjusting her behavior accordingly. When Margaret struggled with a particularly challenging technique, Maya might quietly demonstrate the hand position she'd mastered through hours of practice. When Danny's ambitious projects occasionally collapsed, she'd help clean up the mess, without making it feel like charity. Thomas, their instructor, had begun treating Maya less like a student and more like an assistant. He'd started asking her to help newer students with basic techniques, recognizing that her gentle approach often succeeded where his more direct instruction failed. Maya had discovered that teaching came naturally to her, that she could explain complex concepts through demonstration rather than words, guiding someone's hands into the correct position without making them feel clumsy or inadequate. Thursday painting classes operated under entirely different social rules. Where pottery required patience and methodical skill building, painting attracted people drawn to immediate expression and bold experimentation. The instructor, a local artist named Sandra, who sold landscapes to tourists during the summer months, encouraged students to embrace mistakes as part of the creative process. Maya had initially struggled with this philosophy, her natural perfectionism making it difficult to accept the happy accidents that Sandra praised in other students' work. But gradually, Maya had learned to surrender some control to the medium itself, allowing watercolors to bleed and blend in unexpected ways. She'd developed a signature style that balanced careful planning with spontaneous flourishes, creating pieces that felt both intentional and organic. Her landscapes captured the moody Pacific Northwest atmosphere with a sensitivity that impressed Sandra, who'd started displaying Maya's work prominently during the monthly student exhibitions. Saturday mornings had become Maya's time for personal projects when she could access the studio without the structure of formal classes. She'd work on larger pieces, experimenting with techniques she'd learned during the week or pushing herself to attempt subjects that intimidated her. The building was quieter on weekends, occupied mainly by serious artists renting studio space and the occasional community group using the meeting rooms. It was during these peaceful Saturday sessions that Maya first became aware of the volleyball team's presence in the building. The Pine Creek Youth Athletic League rented the community room every weekend for what they called training sessions, though Maya rarely heard sounds that resembled actual athletic activity. Instead, their voices would echo through the hallways, in waves of laughter and conversation that seemed designed to announce their presence to everyone within a quarter-mile radius. The contrast between the two groups couldn't have been more pronounced. The art students moved through the building with quiet purpose, carrying supplies and speaking in the hushed tones that seemed appropriate for creative spaces. The volleyball players burst through doors like they were making stage entrances, their voices amplified by the confidence that came from winning championships and earning college scholarships. They wore their athletic achievements like armor, displaying team jackets and trophy pins with the casual pride of people who'd never questioned their right to take up space. Maya had learned to time her movements around their schedule, avoiding the main hallway during their arrival and departure times. Not because they'd ever been directly hostile to her, but because their energy felt overwhelming in a way that made her chest tight with anxiety. They existed in a parallel universe where success was measured in wins and losses, where confidence was currency and attention was something to be sought rather than avoided. Zoe Blackwell commanded this universe, with the effortless authority of someone who'd never been told no about anything that mattered to her. Maya had observed her from a distance, studying the way other people's behavior shifted in her presence. Conversations would pause when Zoe entered a room, as if everyone was waiting to see which direction her attention would flow. She had the kind of magnetic personality that drew people into her orbit, whether they wanted to be there or not, the social equivalent of a gravitational field. Emma Martinez served as Zoe's primary satellite, a smaller planet whose entire existence seemed organized around reflecting her leader's brilliance. Maya had noticed how Emma's opinions would shift subtly to match Zoe's preferences, how her laugh would echo Zoe's a half-second later, creating a feedback loop of validation that reinforced their hierarchy. Emma had been team captain during her junior year, but had stepped aside when Zoe transferred from a private school across town, apparently understanding that some people were naturally born to lead while others were meant to follow. Jade Thompson completed their triumvirate, with the kind of nervous energy that came from constantly trying to prove she belonged in their circle. Maya had overheard enough of their conversations to understand that Jade's position was less secure than Emma's, dependent on her willingness to laugh at the right jokes and target the right people for their amusement. She worked harder than the others to maintain Zoe's approval, suggesting increasingly elaborate pranks and schemes with the desperation of someone who feared being excluded. The volleyball team's dominance extended far beyond their athletic achievements. They were the face of Pine Creek youth athletics in local newspaper articles and community fundraising events. Their parents served on school boards and city councils, wielding the kind of social influence that could open doors or close them, depending on their children's needs. They moved through the world with the assumption that rules were suggestions and consequences were things that happened to other people. Maya understood this intuitively, recognizing the signs from her years of careful observation. She'd learned to read power structures the way other people read books, identifying the subtle markers that distinguished predators from prey in social environments. The volleyball players carried themselves with the loose-limbed confidence of apex predators, secure in their position at the top of the local food chain. What Maya didn't fully grasp was how her own growing confidence at the Arts Center had begun to register on their radar. Her work was being displayed more prominently during monthly exhibitions. Thomas had started mentioning her technical progress to other instructors. Sandra had suggested she consider applying to art programs at local colleges, insisting that Maya had natural talent worth developing professionally. These small victories, insignificant as they seemed to Maya, represented exactly the kind of quiet achievement that had always irritated Zoe. Success, in Zoe's worldview, should be loud and public and accompanied by appropriate recognition. People should earn their accomplishments through competition and struggle, not through the patient accumulation of skill in dusty studios, where nobody important would notice. Maya's art felt like cheating to Zoe, a form of success that didn't require the physical prowess and social dominance that had defined Zoe's own achievements. Worse, it represented a type of recognition that Zoe couldn't compete for, couldn't dominate through superior training or natural ability. Not because Maya interviewed particularly well, but because she was the only applicant who'd shown up during the lunch rush and hadn't been intimidated by the chaos of steaming milk and shouted orders. Carla ran the shop with an easy informality that put Maya at ease. There were no performance metrics or optimization strategies, just coffee beans and regular customers, and the simple satisfaction of making something people enjoyed. Working at Grind had given Maya her first taste of competence in years. She'd learned to operate the espresso machine with quiet precision, memorized the orders of regulars, developed a reputation for remembering exactly how people liked their drinks. Customers started requesting her specifically, not because she was chatty or entertaining, but because she listened carefully and never got their orders wrong. For the first time in her life, Maya's natural tendency toward careful observation felt like an asset rather than a limitation. It was Carla who'd suggested the art classes. She'd noticed Maya sketching during her breaks, quick pencil drawings on coffee-stained napkins that captured the personalities of regular customers with surprising accuracy. Carla had mentioned that she'd taken pottery classes at the Riverside Arts Center years ago, had found working with clay therapeutic after her divorce. She'd offered to pay for Maya's first month of classes as a birthday gift, insisting that everyone needed something creative in their lives. Maya had almost declined. The thought of walking into a room full of strangers, of trying to learn a new skill while people watched, made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. But something about the way Carla had described the meditative quality of working with clay, the idea of creating something beautiful with her hands, had appealed to Maya in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The first pottery class had been terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. Maya had chosen a seat in the back corner, as far from the instructor as possible, and spent the first hour convinced that everyone was watching her fumble with the clay. But as the evening progressed, she'd realized that the other students were too focused on their own struggles to pay attention to hers. The instructor, a soft-spoken man named Thomas, had offered gentle guidance without making her feel singled out, and the clay itself had been a revelation. Working with clay required the kind of careful attention that came naturally to Maya. She had to focus on the texture and moisture content, on the pressure of her hands and the speed of the wheel. There was no room for the anxious thoughts that usually crowded her mind, no space for worrying about what other people thought of her. For those 2 hours every Tuesday and Thursday evening, Maya existed only in the present moment, her hands shaping earth into something beautiful and purposeful. Now 3 months later, the Art Center had become the anchor of Maya's week. She'd expanded from pottery to painting classes, discovering that she had an eye for color and composition that surprised her instructors. She'd even started arriving early sometimes, spending extra time in the studio working on personal projects. Her bedroom at home was filling up with bowls and vases, watercolor landscapes and charcoal portraits, physical evidence that she could create something worthwhile. Pine Creek itself had become part of Maya's healing process. The town was small enough to feel manageable, large enough to offer anonymity. She'd developed walking routes that took her past the river and through the downtown area, stopping at the used bookstore and the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. People nodded at her on the street now, recognizing her as Carla's quiet employee, as the girl who took art classes at the community center. She wasn't invisible here exactly, but she wasn't scrutinized either. She existed in that comfortable middle ground between being ignored and being watched. Maya had started to believe that maybe this was enough. Maybe she didn't need to be bold or confident or socially successful. Maybe there was room in the world for people who found their meaning in small, quiet moments, who contributed through careful craftsmanship rather than charismatic leadership. Maybe she could build a life around coffee shops and pottery wheels, around the simple satisfaction of making beautiful things with her hands. She had no idea that her carefully constructed sanctuary was about to be shattered by 3 young women who saw her quietness as weakness, her gentleness as an invitation for cruelty. Maya Shun thought she'd learned to navigate the world safely, staying below the radar and avoiding conflict. She was about to discover that sometimes, no matter how invisible you try to make yourself, trouble finds you anyway. The rhythm of Maya's weekly schedule had become as predictable as the tide. Monday mornings at Grind Coffee, where she'd arrive before sunrise to help Carla prep for the breakfast rush. The familiar ritual of grinding beans and steaming milk provided a meditative start to her week, the mechanical precision of coffee making offering a counterpoint to the creative chaos that awaited her at the Art Center. She'd learned to read the moods of the regular customers through their order modifications, understanding that extra shots usually meant difficult meetings ahead, while requests for decaf often signaled late-night study sessions or insomnia. Tuesday evenings belonged entirely to pottery. Maya would finish her shift at 4, walk the 6 blocks to the Riverside Arts Center, and claim her preferred wheel in the northeast corner of the studio. The late afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting everything in warm amber tones that made even the most amateur attempts look artistic. She'd learned to arrive early enough to secure her favorite spot, but not so early that she'd have to make small talk with the other students while they set up their workstations. The pottery studio had its own ecosystem, a delicate balance of personalities that Maya had spent months learning to navigate. There was Margaret, a retired librarian who treated clay like it was made of spun gold, working with microscopic precision on tiny figurines that took her weeks to complete. At the opposite end of the spectrum was Danny, a tattooed 20-something who threw massive, asymmetrical vessels with the kind of confident abandon that Maya secretly envied. Between them existed a spectrum of skill levels and artistic approaches, from Linda's geometric minimalism to Frank's elaborate decorative techniques. Maya had found her place within this community through careful observation and strategic positioning. Maya had found something that existed outside Zoe's sphere of influence, and that independence felt like a challenge that needed to be addressed. The Arts Center itself had become symbolic of this tension. The building housed two completely different ecosystems, each with its own values and measures of success. The volleyball team brought energy and funding, filling the community room with the kind of dynamic activity that looked good in promotional materials and attracted donations from local businesses. The art programs brought culture and creativity, offering the kind of enrichment opportunities that help the community qualify for grants and attract families looking for educational resources. Maya had thrived in this environment precisely because it allowed her to exist in the margins, participating in the cultural life of the community without having to compete for attention or status. She'd built relationships based on shared interests, rather than social positioning, earning respect through skill development, rather than performance of personality. For the first time in her life, she'd found a place where her natural inclinations felt like assets rather than limitations. But this sanctuary was built on the assumption that different types of people could coexist peacefully, each group focused on their own goals and leaving the others alone. Maya had never considered that her quiet success might be perceived as a threat by people who viewed the world in terms of winners and losers, dominance and submission. She'd assumed that staying invisible would keep her safe, not understanding that some predators were specifically drawn to prey that appeared vulnerable and isolated. The collision between these two worlds was inevitable, set in motion by forces that Maya couldn't have predicted or prevented. Her growing confidence had made her visible just enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. Her gentleness had been mistaken for weakness by people who confused kindness with cowardice, and her assumption that art could exist separate from the brutal social dynamics that had shaped her entire life was about to be tested in ways that would change everything she believed about herself and the world around her. Zoe Blackwell first noticed Maya Chun during the third week of September, on a Thursday evening when the volleyball team had stayed late to decorate the community room for their upcoming fundraiser. The athletes had been hanging streamers and arranging silent auction items when Zoe stepped into the hallway to take a phone call from her boyfriend, who attended a college 3 hours away, and called every evening at exactly 7:15 to maintain their connection despite the distance. The conversation had been routine, mostly complaints about professors and updates about weekend plans. But as Zoe talked, she'd become aware of movement in the art studio down the hall. Through the partially open door, she could see a young woman working alone at a pottery wheel, her movements fluid and confident in a way that seemed at odds with her unremarkable appearance. The woman's focus was absolute, her attention entirely absorbed by the clay spinning between her hands, and something about that self-contained concentration had irritated Zoe in a way she couldn't immediately identify. After ending her call, Zoe had lingered in the hallway, pretending to check her phone while studying the pottery student more closely. The woman was Asian, probably in her late teens or early 20s, with straight black hair that fell across her face as she worked. She wore an oversized flannel shirt over paint-stained jeans, the kind of deliberately unfashionable outfit that Zoe associated with people who'd given up on caring about their appearance. But her hands moved with surprising skill, shaping the clay into graceful curves that suggested hours of dedicated practice. What bothered Zoe most was the woman's obvious contentment. She worked with the kind of serene focus that Zoe had never experienced herself, even during her most successful volleyball matches. Zoe's achievements had always been accompanied by adrenaline and competition, by the rush of victory over opponents who'd fought just as hard for the same prize. This woman seemed to find satisfaction in solitary creation, in making something beautiful for its own sake rather than for recognition or reward. Over the following weeks, Zoe found herself paying increasing attention to the art studio's activities. She'd volunteer for tasks that took her past the pottery room during class times, observing the quiet community that had formed around the wheels and kilns. The pottery students were an eclectic mix of ages and backgrounds, united by their shared interest in working with clay, and they interacted with a casual friendliness that felt foreign to Zoe's highly competitive social environment. The young woman, who Zoe eventually learned was named Maya, seemed to occupy a special position within this group. Other students would ask for her advice on technical problems, and the instructor frequently used her work as examples during demonstrations. Maya had developed into something approaching a teaching assistant, despite appearing to be one of the younger students in the class. Her skill level had progressed remarkably quickly, and the pieces she created showed an artistic sensibility that impressed even Zoe, who prided herself on having refined taste. This recognition began to eat at Zoe in ways she struggled to articulate. She'd been raised to believe that success required struggle, that achievements meant nothing unless they'd been earned through competition and sacrifice. Her parents had invested thousands of dollars and countless hours in her athletic development, driving her to tournaments across the state and hiring private coaches to refine her technique. Every trophy in her bedroom represented months of training, discipline, and the systematic defeat of opponents who'd wanted victory just as badly as she did. Maya's artistic success felt like cheating by comparison. She'd simply shown up at a community center, paid modest fees for classes, and discovered a natural talent that earned her recognition without any apparent suffering or sacrifice. She'd found fulfillment in an arena where Zoe couldn't compete, where athletic prowess and social dominance meant nothing. Worse, Maya seemed genuinely uninterested in the kind of recognition that Zoe craved, content to create beautiful objects for an audience of fellow artists, rather than seeking broader acknowledgement for her achievements. Emma Martinez had been the first to notice Zoe's preoccupation with the pottery studio. During a team meeting in late October, she'd caught Zoe staring down the hallway toward the art classes, instead of focusing on their discussion about playoff strategies. When Emma mentioned this observation privately after the meeting, Zoe had dismissed it as boredom with their repetitive training routines, but Emma's attention had been aroused. Emma possessed the kind of social intelligence that came from years of careful observation, studying the people around her for clues about how to position herself advantageously within group dynamics. She'd learned to read Zoe's moods and preferences with scientific precision, understanding that her own status within their social circle depended on her ability to anticipate and fulfill Zoe's needs before they were explicitly stated. Jade Thompson had joined their informal surveillance of Maya during the first week of November, drawn by the promise of participating in whatever scheme Zoe was developing. Jade's position within their group was more precarious than Emma's, earned through her willingness to execute increasingly elaborate pranks against targets Zoe selected. She'd gained her current status by orchestrating the humiliation of a debate team captain who'd criticized the volleyball team's academic performance during a student government meeting, and she maintained her place by constantly proposing new ways to assert their dominance over potential rivals. The three young women began conducting regular reconnaissance missions, timing their activities to coincide with Maya's art classes and observing her behavior with the methodical attention of military strategists. They learned her schedule, her preferred workstation, her relationships with other students and instructors. They studied her body language, noting the way she moved through the building with careful steps and downcast eyes, the way she seemed to shrink when forced to interact with people outside her artistic circle. Maya's obvious shyness registered as vulnerability in their assessment, confirming their assumption that she would be unable to defend herself effectively against a coordinated campaign of harassment. Her lack of apparent social connections outside the art classes suggested that she wouldn't have allies to call upon for support. Her quiet demeanor indicated that she would be unlikely to report their activities to authority figures, preferring to endure abuse rather than risk drawing additional attention to herself. The bubble wrap plan emerged during a brainstorming session in Emma's basement, where the three athletes had gathered ostensibly to work on a school project, but actually to develop strategies for asserting their dominance over Maya. They'd been discussing various scenarios for public humiliation when Jade mentioned seeing the massive rolls of packaging materials stored in the Arts Center's supply closet, left over from a recent sculpture exhibition that had required careful shipping of delicate pieces. Zoe had seized on this detail immediately, recognizing the symbolic perfection of using packaging materials to demonstrate Maya's worthlessness. They would literally treat her like an object to be wrapped and stored, reducing her from a person to a piece of merchandise. The visual metaphor was so compelling that Zoe began elaborating on it immediately, describing how they could corner Maya in an isolated location and systematically wrap her in bubble wrap until she was completely immobilized. The plan evolved over several meetings, growing more elaborate as each participant contributed details designed to maximize Maya's humiliation and their own entertainment. They would wait until evening classes ended and the building was mostly empty, then ambush Maya in the pottery studio, where she often stayed late to work on personal projects. Emma would block the exit while Jade secured the necessary supplies, leaving Zoe free to orchestrate the actual wrapping process. They'd document the entire event with their phones, creating a permanent record of Maya's helplessness that could be shared strategically to ensure her social destruction extended far beyond the immediate incident. The photographs would serve as evidence of her complete powerlessness, proof that she existed at their mercy and could be degraded whenever they chose. They planned to leave her wrapped and struggling in the studio, where she'd eventually be discovered by cleaning staff or security guards, adding professional consequences to her personal humiliation. The psychological effects would be even more devastating than the physical ones, they reasoned. Maya would never again feel safe in the building that had become her sanctuary, never again be able to focus on her art without remembering the moment when her vulnerability had been exposed and exploited. She would understand that her quiet success existed only because they'd allowed it, and that tolerance could be revoked at any moment if she failed to remember her proper place in the social hierarchy. Maya remained oblivious to their planning, continuing her regular routine with the trusting assumption that her low profile would protect her from the kind of conflicts that had plagued her throughout school. She'd grown comfortable in the Arts Center, allowing herself to relax in ways that would have been impossible in more competitive environments. Her guard was completely down, her attention focused on artistic development rather than social defense. The irony wasn't lost on Zoe, who'd begun to view Maya's contentment as a personal insult. Maya had found exactly the kind of peaceful fulfillment that Zoe craved but had never experienced. Despite all her achievements and accolades, Maya's happiness existed independently of external validation, drawing its strength from internal sources that Zoe couldn't attack or undermine through conventional competition. This independence made Maya dangerous in ways that Zoe struggled to articulate, representing a form of success that existed outside the system Zoe had mastered. If people could find satisfaction through quiet creation rather than public achievement, if they could build meaningful lives without competing for recognition and status, then everything Zoe had worked for became less valuable by comparison. Maya's very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions that had shaped Zoe's identity and worldview. The bubble wrap plan represented more than simple bullying to Zoe. It was a declaration of war against the idea that people could opt out of hierarchical competition, a demonstration that vulnerability would always be exploited by those with greater power. Maya had made the mistake of believing that gentleness could coexist with strength, that creativity could flourish independently of social dynamics. Zoe intended to teach her otherwise, using methods that would ensure the lesson was never forgotten. November was drawing to a close, and the volleyball team season was winding down after a successful playoff run that had earned them regional recognition. Zoe had more free time and fewer constructive outlets for the competitive energy that defined her personality. Maya's continued presence in the building felt like an ongoing provocation, a daily reminder that some people had found paths to satisfaction that didn't require the struggle and sacrifice that had consumed Zoe's entire adolescence. The plan was scheduled for implementation during the first week of December, when final art projects would keep Maya working late in the studio and holiday breaks would reduce the building's overall activity level. Everything was in place, from the supplies they'd need to the timing that would ensure maximum isolation and minimum interference. Maya had no idea that her sanctuary was about to become a battleground, or that her quiet resistance to conventional social hierarchies had marked her as a target for forces she'd never imagined could threaten her carefully constructed peace. December arrived in Pine Creek with the kind of bitter cold that made the Riverside Arts Center feel like a refuge from winter's harsh reality. The heating system worked overtime to maintain comfortable temperatures throughout the building, creating pockets of warmth that drew people deeper into the interior spaces. Maya had settled into her evening routine with the comfort of established ritual, arriving at the pottery studio just as the last of the day classes were packing up their supplies. The transition between day and evening activities created a peaceful lull that Maya had grown to treasure, a time when the building belonged to the dedicated few who stayed late to pursue their artistic passions. Tonight felt different somehow, charged with an energy that Maya couldn't quite identify. The hallways seemed quieter than usual, lacking the casual chatter and footsteps that typically echoed through the building during evening hours. She'd passed only 2 other people on her way to the pottery studio, both heading toward the exit with the hurried purposefulness of individuals eager to escape the December chill. The building's evening cleaning crew wouldn't arrive for another 3 hours, leaving Maya with the kind of solitude she'd grown to treasure during her most productive creative sessions. The pottery studio welcomed her with familiar sense of clay and mineral glazes, the earthy aromas that had become associated with peace and creative fulfillment in Maya's mind. Late afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting everything in warm amber tones that made even the most amateur attempts look artistic. Maya claimed her preferred wheel in the northeast corner, where the evening light created the kind of golden atmosphere that inspired her best work. The studio's heating system hummed quietly in the background, maintaining the consistent temperature necessary for proper clay work while creating a gentle white noise that helped Maya focus. Maya had planned to spend the evening working on a large serving bowl that had been challenging her technical skills for weeks. The piece required a level of precision that pushed her abilities to their current limits, demanding the kind of focused attention that made hours pass like minutes. She'd been experimenting with a glazing technique that Thomas had demonstrated during their last class, layering different materials to create depth and texture that would complement the bowl's graceful proportions. The project represented everything Maya loved about pottery work, the combination of technical skill and artistic vision that produced objects both beautiful and functional. She began her ritual of preparation with meditative care, centering the clay on her wheel and adjusting the water basin to her preferred height. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, testing the clay's consistency and moisture content with the kind of tactile knowledge that came from months of dedicated practice. The familiar weight of the material between her palms grounded her in the present moment, shutting out the anxieties and uncertainties that typically crowded her thoughts during interactions with the outside world. As Maya began working the clay, her mind settled into the focused state that made pottery work so therapeutic. The wheel spun with mechanical precision, providing a steady rhythm that synchronized with her breathing and heartbeat. Her hands shaped the clay with gentle pressure, coaxing it into the form she'd envisioned while remaining responsive to the material's natural tendencies. This collaboration between artist and medium had become Maya's favorite aspect of pottery work, the way successful pieces emerged from negotiation rather than domination. The studio's peaceful atmosphere was gradually disrupted by sounds from elsewhere in the building that seemed unusual for this time of evening. Footsteps in the main hallway, moving with deliberate purpose rather than the casual pace of someone heading home. Voices speaking in hushed tones, too quiet for Maya to distinguish words, but carrying an undertone of excitement that felt somehow predatory. Maya's hands continued their work on the wheel, but her attention was now divided between the clay and the growing sense that something was happening beyond her isolated sanctuary. Years of careful observation had taught Maya to recognize the subtle signs that preceded social confrontations, the quality of silence that indicated people were trying not to be overheard, the particular cadence of whispered conversations that suggested planning rather than casual discussion, the sound of footsteps that moved with coordination rather than coincidence. All these elements were present in the sounds filtering through the pottery studio's partially open door, creating a pattern that triggered Maya's well-developed danger recognition instincts. Maya's concentration wavered as her instincts began, sending warning signals that she couldn't quite interpret. The pottery studio's door stood partially open, as Maya preferred when working alone, allowing air circulation and creating a connection to the broader building that prevented the claustrophobic feeling of complete isolation. Through this opening, she could hear the sounds growing closer, accompanied by what sounded like rustling plastic and suppressed laughter that carried undertones of anticipated cruelty. The approaching footsteps were deliberately quiet, but not quite silent, suggesting people who were trying to avoid detection without completely eliminating the sounds of their movement. Maya recognized this pattern from her school years, when groups of students would coordinate their approach to isolated targets with just enough stealth to avoid adult supervision while maintaining the intimidation factor of an obviously planned confrontation. The rustling plastic added an element Maya couldn't immediately identify, but its presence suggested preparation and forethought that elevated the situation beyond casual harassment. Maya's hands stilled on the pottery wheel as she tried to assess the developing situation. Her heart rate increased as she recognized the deliberate nature of the approaching sounds, the coordination that suggested multiple people moving with shared purpose toward her location. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, occurring during the brief window when the building was nearly empty, but not yet officially closed. Someone had been observing her schedule carefully enough to predict when she would be alone and vulnerable. The laughter she'd been hearing grew closer and more distinct, revealing the particular quality of amusement that Maya associated with people who derived pleasure from others' discomfort. It was the sound of individuals who had never been on the receiving end of social cruelty, who viewed harassment as entertainment rather than trauma. Maya had heard similar laughter throughout her academic career, always preceding moments of humiliation that had shaped her defensive strategies and social withdrawal. Zoe Blackwell appeared in the doorway first, her athletic frame silhouetted against the hallway lighting in a way that immediately commanded attention. She wore her team jacket over dark jeans, the kind of casual uniform that announced her status to anyone who understood the local social hierarchies. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, and her expression carried the predatory satisfaction of someone who'd been anticipating this moment for weeks. Zoe's posture radiated confidence and entitlement, the body language of someone who'd never questioned her right to enter any space and take control of whatever situation she encountered. Emma Martinez followed immediately behind Zoe, struggling to manage what appeared to be a large roll of bubble wrap that she carried with obvious effort. Her nervous energy was palpable, manifesting in quick glances between Zoe and Maya, as if seeking approval for their presence in the studio. Emma had always been more comfortable as a follower than a leader, and her body language suggested she was operating outside her natural comfort zone, while trying to project confidence she didn't genuinely feel. The bubble wrap she carried was industrial-grade material, the kind used for shipping valuable or fragile items, suggesting this was not a spontaneous decision, but a carefully planned operation. Jade Thompson brought up the rear of their small procession, her arms full of additional packaging supplies that included heavy-duty tape, professional-grade scissors, and what looked like industrial-strength plastic sheeting. She moved with the jittery excitement of someone who'd been anticipating this confrontation for so long that the reality felt almost surreal. Jade's eyes darted around the pottery studio, taking in the wheels and tools and finished pieces with the kind of dismissive assessment that suggested she viewed Maya's artistic environment as somehow inferior to her own athletic domain. The three young women arranged themselves strategically around the studio space with military precision that revealed extensive planning. Emma positioned herself near the main exit, effectively blocking Maya's most obvious escape route while maintaining the pretense of casual positioning. Jade controlled access to the supply closet and emergency exit, her placement ensuring that Maya couldn't reach any tools or alternative exits that might provide defensive options. Zoe positioned herself closest to Maya's pottery wheel, claiming the dominant position that would allow her to direct the encounter while remaining close enough to prevent Maya from moving freely around the studio. Maya's hands remained motionless on the pottery wheel as she absorbed the reality of their coordinated arrival. Her heart rate increased dramatically as she recognized the deliberate nature of their positioning, the military-style tactics that transformed their presence from casual visit to coordinated ambush. The setup felt professional in its precision, suggesting a level of planning that elevated this encounter far beyond typical teenage harassment into something that approached assault. The bubble wrap and plastic sheeting created an ominous visual element that Maya couldn't immediately interpret, though their presence clearly indicated intentions that went beyond verbal intimidation. Maya had experienced various forms of bullying throughout her academic career, but none had involved physical restraints or packaging materials. The unfamiliar elements added layers of uncertainty to an already threatening situation, forcing Maya to consider possibilities she'd never had to contemplate before. Well, Zoe's voice cut through the studio's peaceful atmosphere with the kind of false cheerfulness that immediately set Maya's nerves on edge. Look what we have here. The little artist working all alone in her secret hideaway. Zoe's tone carried undertones of mockery and threat that made Maya's chest tighten with familiar anxiety. She'd heard similar voices throughout her school years, always preceding moments of humiliation and social cruelty that had shaped her. Defensive instincts and withdrawal strategies. Maya attempted to project calm while her mind raced through possible responses to their unexpected intrusion. Her years of experience with bullying situations had taught her that the initial response often determined how far tormentors would escalate their behavior. Showing fear typically encouraged further aggression, while appearing too confident could provoke more severe retaliation. Maya had learned to navigate this narrow path by offering minimal resistance while avoiding complete submission, though. The current situation felt different from anything she'd encountered before. "The studio's open to everyone," Maya said quietly, her voice barely audible above the pottery wheel's mechanical hum. "I can move to a different area if you need this space for something." Maya's default response to potential conflict had always been accommodation, attempting to diffuse tension through immediate surrender of whatever territory or resources others wanted to claim. This strategy had sometimes prevented escalation in school settings, though it had also reinforced her status as a preferred target for future harassment. Jade laughed with the kind of harsh amusement that suggested Maya's offer had missed the point entirely. "Oh, we're not here to use the pottery wheels," she said, hefting the plastic sheeting in a way that made its intended purpose unmistakably clear. "We're here to teach you something important about knowing your place in this community." Jade's words carried the rehearsed quality of someone who'd practiced this confrontation multiple times, polishing her delivery until it achieved maximum psychological impact. The mention of Maya's place in the community triggered memories of similar conversations from her school years, when popular students had felt compelled to explain social hierarchies to those they deemed inferior. Maya recognized the language of dominance assertion, the coded threats that preceded systematic humiliation campaigns designed to reinforce existing power structures. She'd hoped that leaving the school environment would free her from these dynamics. But apparently, some patterns transcended institutional boundaries. Emma began unrolling the bubble wrap with deliberate slowness, the plastic crackling and popping in a way that filled the studio with an ominous soundtrack. "You see, Maya," Emma said, her voice carrying nervous excitement, "we've been watching you for weeks. Seeing how you float around this building like you own the place. How you act like you're something special because you can make a few bowls and paint some pictures." Emma's criticism felt particularly stinging because it attacked the one area where Maya had found genuine confidence and satisfaction. The accusation of entitlement shocked Maya more than direct insults would have. She'd spent months carefully maintaining the lowest possible profile, arriving early and leaving late to avoid social interactions, speaking only when directly addressed, and consistently deferring to other students' preferences for equipment and workspace. Maya couldn't imagine how her behavior could be interpreted as presumptuous or self-important, but she recognized that bullies often projected motivations onto their targets that existed primarily in their own imaginations. Maya stood slowly from her pottery wheel, clay still coating her hands as she tried to assess the situation with the kind of analytical thinking that had helped her navigate dangerous social situations throughout her academic career. 3 against 1, with exits blocked and their intentions clearly hostile. They'd chosen the timing carefully, ensuring minimal chance of interruption from other students or staff members. Maya's mind cataloged these details with the systematic precision of someone who'd spent years studying predator behavior from the prey's perspective. The rational part of Maya's mind recognized that this situation had moved beyond typical bullying into territory that could involve serious physical harm. The packaging materials suggested intentions that went far beyond verbal humiliation, and their coordination indicated planning that elevated this encounter to the level of premeditated assault. Maya had always assumed that her policy of complete non-confrontation would protect her from the kind of severe harassment that required this level of organization and preparation. "I don't want any trouble," Maya said, her voice gaining slight strength as she tried to project more confidence than she actually felt. "Whatever this is about, I'm sure we can talk through it without anyone getting hurt." Maya's words were calculated to appeal to whatever rational thinking might still influence their decision-making, though the supplies they'd brought suggested they'd moved far beyond the point where reasonable discussion would change their intentions. Zoe stepped closer to Maya, closing the distance between them with the kind of controlled aggression that athletes learned through years of competitive training. "The problem, Maya, is that you've forgotten how things work around here. You've gotten comfortable, thinking you can just exist in your little bubble without acknowledging the people who actually matter in this community." Zoe's words carried the authority of someone who'd never questioned her right to determine other people's worth and position within social hierarchies. The reference to existing in a bubble took on literal meaning as Emma and Jade began positioning the packaging materials around Maya with practiced efficiency. They'd clearly rehearsed this process, coordinating their movements to prevent Maya from moving toward any potential escape route. Maya found herself increasingly surrounded by plastic, sheeting and bubble wrap, the materials creating an impromptu prison that would soon become her wrapping. "Here's what's going to happen," Zoe continued, her voice taking on the kind of instructional tone that suggested she viewed this as an educational experience rather than simple cruelty. "We're going to wrap you up like the worthless package you are. take some pictures to document the moment, and leave you here for the cleaning crew to find. By tomorrow morning, everyone in town will know exactly what you're worth." Maya's breathing became shallow as the full scope of their plan became clear. The humiliation would be total and permanent, documented in photographs that could be shared indefinitely through social media and personal networks. Her carefully constructed sanctuary would be destroyed. Her artistic community would view her as a victim rather than a peer, and her fragile confidence would be shattered beyond any possibility of repair. The psychological damage would extend far beyond the immediate physical discomfort, creating lasting trauma that would affect every future social interaction. The packaging metaphor was particularly cruel in its symbolic implications. By literally treating Maya like an object to be wrapped and stored, they would reduce her from a person to a piece of merchandise. The visual metaphor would reinforce their message about her lack of human worth while creating a humiliating image that could be reproduced and shared as evidence of her complete powerlessness. Maya realized that this plan had been designed not just to cause immediate suffering, but to create permanent documentation of her degradation. Emma produced a smartphone and began recording as Jade positioned the plastic sheeting for optimal wrapping coverage. The technological element added another layer of horror to the situation, transforming Maya's assault into content creation for their social media platforms. Maya recognized that she was about to become part of a viral humiliation campaign, her suffering commodified for the entertainment of people she'd never met, who would judge her based on a few minutes of footage documenting her worst moment. But as Zoe reached for the first piece of bubble wrap, something unexpected began happening inside Maya's mind. Instead of the familiar paralysis that had characterized her response to bullying throughout her academic career, she felt a different kind of energy beginning to build in her chest. It started as warmth, spreading outward from her core through her arms and legs, accompanied by a clarity of thought that felt almost supernatural in its intensity. Maya's hands, still coated with clay from her pottery work, began to tingle with sensation that felt like electricity running just beneath her skin. The familiar anxiety that typically overwhelmed her in confrontational situations was being replaced by something else entirely, something that felt like power awakening after years of dormancy. Maya had always been strong for her size, capable of lifting clay bags and moving pottery equipment that challenged students twice her weight, but this felt different. This felt like strength that came from sources she'd never accessed before. The sensation was unlike anything Maya had experienced in her 19 years of life. It felt as though dormant systems throughout her body were suddenly activating, muscles and reflexes that had been sleeping beneath the surface of her conscious awareness. Her vision seemed sharper, picking up details in her peripheral vision that she'd never noticed before. Her hearing became more acute, allowing her to distinguish individual heartbeats and breathing patterns from each of her attackers. Most remarkably, her mind felt clearer and more focused than it ever had, processing information and calculating responses with computer-like precision. Maya's transformation was not immediately visible to Zoe, Emma, and Jade, who remained focused on their planned assault without recognizing that their intended victim was undergoing a fundamental change. They continued positioning their materials and coordinating their movements according to the strategy they'd rehearsed, confident that Maya would react with the same helpless submission they'd observed in her previous social interactions. Their assumption that past behavior predicted future response was about to prove catastrophically incorrect. When Zoe finally grabbed Maya's wrist to begin the wrapping process, Maya's response surprised everyone in the room, including herself. Instead of submitting to the restraint, Maya's hand closed around Zoe's forearm with grip strength that made the volleyball captain gasp in sudden pain. Maya's fingers, still slick with clay, pressed into Zoe's skin with force that left visible impressions, and Zoe's confident expression immediately shifted to confusion and concern. The grip strength Maya exerted was far beyond what should have been possible for someone of her apparent physical capabilities. Zoe had spent years developing her athletic prowess, building muscle mass and hand strength through countless hours of training and competition. She'd never encountered anyone outside of professional athletic circles who could match her physical capabilities, and Maya's grip felt like it was made of steel cable wrapped in human skin, exerting pressure that threatened to crack bones if she chose to increase the force. "Let go of me," Zoe demanded, trying to pull away from Maya's grip, but finding herself unable to break free from fingers that seemed impossibly strong for someone of Maya's apparent physical capabilities. Maya's hand remained locked around Zoe's forearm with unbreakable determination, and Zoe's attempts to escape only resulted in increased pressure that sent sharp pain shooting up her arm. Zoe had never experienced being physically dominated by someone she'd assumed was weaker than herself, and the reality was psychologically devastating. Maya's voice, when she finally spoke, carried a quality that none of them had heard before. Gone was the whispered timidity that had characterized all her previous interactions, replaced by something that sounded like barely controlled violence. "I said I don't want any trouble," Maya repeated, her words now carrying undertones that made Emma and Jade step backward instinctively. "But if you insist on bringing trouble to me, you should understand what you're getting into." The change in Maya's vocal tone was as dramatic as her increased physical strength. Where she'd previously spoken in soft, apologetic whispers designed to avoid drawing attention, her voice now carried authority and threat that seemed to vibrate through the Pottery Studio's walls. Emma and Jade recognized the sound of genuine danger in Maya's words, the kind of controlled aggression that preceded serious violence rather than empty posturing. Emma tried to help Zoe by grabbing Maya's other arm, attempting to break the grip through superior numbers, but Maya's free hand moved with speed that seemed impossible for someone who'd shown no previous signs of athletic ability. Maya caught Emma's wrist before she could complete her grasp, holding both attackers with strength that made their resistance futile. Emma's face showed genuine fear as she realized that their carefully planned ambush had encountered a variable they'd never considered. The speed of Maya's reaction was as shocking as her strength. Emma had moved with the coordination and timing developed through years of volleyball training, expecting to catch Maya off guard and overwhelm her through rapid action. Instead, Maya had anticipated the movement and countered it with reflexes that seemed almost superhuman in their precision. Emma found herself trapped in a grip that was not only unbreakable, but was being applied with increasing pressure that threatened to cut off circulation to her hand. Jade, still holding the plastic sheeting, began backing toward the door as she recognized that their situation had fundamentally changed. Maya was no longer the helpless victim they'd expected to find, and the power dynamic they'd assumed would govern this confrontation had shifted in ways that none of them understood. Jade's athletic training told her to flee when faced with superior force, but loyalty to her teammates kept her from abandoning them entirely. The plastic sheeting in Jade's hands now seemed laughably inadequate as a tool for restraining someone with Maya's apparent capabilities. What had seemed like clever preparation for subduing a weak target now looked like bringing butterfly nets to capture a wild animal. Jade's confidence in their plan evaporated as she watched Maya effortlessly control two trained athletes simultaneously, demonstrating strength that defied every assumption they'd made about her physical capabilities. Maya began to stand, still maintaining her grip on both Zoe and Emma, rising to her full height with fluid grace that suggested complete control over her physical capabilities. The clay on her hands had dried slightly, creating textured surfaces that made her grip even more secure and intimidating. Maya's movements carried the kind of purposeful precision that athletes recognized as the signature of someone operating at peak physical efficiency, though her apparent abilities seemed to exceed what should have been possible through training alone. As Maya rose to her feet, The atmosphere in the pottery studio underwent a fundamental transformation. Where moments before the three athletes had controlled the space through coordination and superior numbers, Maya now dominated through sheer physical presence and the radiating threat of capabilities they couldn't comprehend. The furniture and equipment that had seemed to favor the attackers by limiting escape routes now appeared to confine them with someone far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. "You came here to wrap me up like a package," Maya said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "To treat me like an object that could be disposed of according to your convenience. To document my helplessness for your entertainment and my permanent humiliation." Maya's summary of their intentions was delivered with the kind of analytical clarity that made their plan sound even more cruel when spoken aloud. Her ability to articulate their motivations while physically restraining them demonstrated a level of control that was deeply unsettling to her captives. Zoe tried again to break free from Maya's grip, using techniques she'd learned through years of athletic training, but Maya's hold remained unbreakable. The pressure on Zoe's arm was increasing gradually, not enough to cause immediate injury, but sufficient to make clear that Maya could escalate the force whenever she chose. Zoe's confidence was evaporating as she realized that her assumptions about Maya's vulnerability had been completely incorrect. The realization that she had fundamentally misjudged the situation was devastating to Zoe's self-image and worldview. She'd built her identity around being able to accurately assess and dominate social situations, particularly when dealing with individuals she perceived as weaker than herself. Maya's unexpected capabilities challenged not just the specific plan, but Zoe's entire understanding of how power dynamics operated in social interactions. "Here's what's actually going to happen," Maya continued, her voice now carrying authority that seemed to transform the entire dynamic of their confrontation. "You're going to leave this studio immediately, taking your bubble wrap and your cameras and your plans for humiliation with you. You're going to forget that this conversation ever happened, and you're never going to approach me again for any reason." Maya's ultimatum was delivered with the kind of quiet certainty that made resistance seem futile rather than merely difficult. Her words carried implications of consequences that extended far beyond what they were currently experiencing, suggesting that continued aggression would result in escalation they wouldn't want to endure. The contrast between Maya's current authority and her previous timidity was so dramatic that it seemed like she'd been replaced by an entirely different person. Emma whimpered as Maya's grip tightened slightly, the pressure becoming genuinely painful rather than merely restraining. Maya's strength seemed to be increasing rather than diminishing, as if the confrontation was activating physical capabilities that had been dormant until this moment. Emma had never experienced anything like this from someone who appeared so physically unremarkable, and her mind struggled to process the reality of their situation. The pain in Emma's wrist was unlike anything she'd experienced during years of athletic training and competition. Maya's grip felt like it was compressing not just skin and muscle, but bone itself, creating pressure that threatened permanent damage if allowed to continue. Emma's athletic experience had taught her to recognize when she was overmatched physically, and every instinct was screaming that continued resistance would result in serious injury. Maya's awareness of her own capabilities was expanding in real time as she tested the limits of her newfound strength. She could feel the exact amount of pressure she was applying to each attacker's arm, could sense their pain levels and adjust accordingly to maintain control without causing permanent damage. This level of tactile sensitivity was completely new to her, as was the precision with which she could modulate her grip strength. Maya was discovering that she possessed capabilities she'd never known existed, abilities that seemed to have awakened in response to the immediate threat she faced. Jade attempted to approach from behind while Maya was focused on restraining Zoe and Emma, hoping to use the element of surprise to restore their numerical advantage. But Maya sensed the movement without turning around, her enhanced awareness allowing her to track all three attackers simultaneously. Without releasing her grip on the other two, Maya kicked backward with her left leg, catching Jade in the stomach with force that sent her stumbling across the studio. The precision of Maya's backward kick was impossible to explain through normal athletic training. She'd struck Jade without looking, calculating the exact angle and force necessary to disable her without causing serious injury, all while maintaining perfect balance and control over her other captives. The level of spatial awareness and physical coordination required for such a maneuver exceeded what should have been possible for someone without extensive martial arts training. Jade hit the wall beside the supply closet and slumped to the floor, gasping for breath and staring at Maya, with a mixture of fear and confusion that suggested her entire understanding of the situation had been overturned. The casual ease with which Maya had disabled her while simultaneously restraining two other people demonstrated capabilities that fell completely outside Jade's frame of reference for normal human physical ability. Maya released both Zoe and Emma simultaneously, stepping back to give them space to retreat, while maintaining a posture that suggested she was prepared for any further aggressive action they might attempt. The sudden release was as controlled as the initial restraint had been, demonstrating that Maya's enhanced capabilities included not just increased strength, but improved fine motor control that allowed her to modulate her responses with surgical precision. Zoe and Emma stumbled backward, rubbing their arms where Maya's fingers had left red marks that would probably develop into bruises over the following days. Both athletes looked shaken in ways that suggested this confrontation had challenged fundamental assumptions about their own capabilities and dominance. The physical evidence of Maya's grip strength would serve as lasting reminders that their assessment of her vulnerability had been catastrophically incorrect. The marks on their arms were more than just physical evidence of Maya's strength. They represented the collapse of their entire worldview regarding social hierarchies and personal power. Zoe and Emma had never been physically dominated by someone they'd perceived as inferior, and the experience was reshaping their understanding of their own position in the world's power structures. "This isn't over," Zoe said, though her voice lacked the conviction she'd carried when entering the studio. Maya's unexpected strength had undermined her confidence in ways that would take time to process and understand. Zoe had built her identity around physical superiority and social dominance, but Maya had demonstrated capabilities that fell completely outside her frame of reference for normal human ability. Maya smiled for the first time since their arrival, and the expression carried implications that made all three athletes step backward toward the exit. "Yes, it is," Maya said simply. "It's completely over. And if you ever decide it isn't, you'll discover that tonight was me being gentle with you." Maya's words were delivered with quiet certainty that made clear she possessed resources they hadn't yet seen, capabilities they wouldn't want to experience under less restrained circumstances. The threat implicit in Maya's words was particularly terrifying because it was delivered without emotion or anger, suggesting that her restraint was strategic rather than instinctive. The implication that she had been deliberately minimizing her response opened up possibilities for escalation that none of them wanted to contemplate. Maya's calm demeanor suggested that violence was simply a tool she could deploy when necessary, rather than an emotional response to provocation. Jade struggled to her feet and helped gather their abandoned supplies as Zoe and Emma retreated toward the hallway, their earlier coordination replaced by hasty flight that suggested genuine fear, rather than strategic withdrawal. The bubble wrap and plastic sheeting that had been intended for Maya's humiliation were now being carried away as evidence of their failed ambush, physical reminders of how completely their assumptions had been proven wrong. The retreat was disorganized and panicked, lacking any of the military precision that had characterized their arrival. Emma dropped the bubble wrap twice while trying to gather it, her hands shaking from residual pain and psychological shock. Jade moved with obvious discomfort from Maya's kick, her breathing still labored from the impact. Zoe attempted to maintain some dignity in their withdrawal, but her frequent glances back at Maya revealed continuing fear that their departure might be interrupted by further demonstration of Maya's capabilities. Maya watched them leave, her hands still tingling with the residual energy that had allowed her to overpower two trained athletes without apparent effort. She flexed her fingers experimentally, noting that the sensation of unusual strength beginning to fade, leaving her wondering if she'd imagined the entire experience. But the red marks on her hands where she'd gripped the attackers, and the shocked expressions on their faces, confirmed that something extraordinary had indeed occurred. The physical evidence of the confrontation was undeniable, but Maya struggled to comprehend how she'd accomplished what seemed impossible just minutes before. Her hands showed clear signs of the intense grip strength she'd exerted, with slight bruising where her fingers had pressed against the attacker's arms. The clay on her hands had been compressed into new patterns by the force she'd applied, creating textural evidence of capabilities she'd never known she possessed. Maya examined her hands more closely, noting that the tingling sensation was gradually subsiding but leaving behind a residual awareness of strength that felt different from anything she'd experienced before. It was as though she'd accessed a reservoir of physical capability that had always existed, but had never been available to her conscious mind. The sensation was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, opening up possibilities she'd never considered while raising questions about the nature and extent of her hidden abilities. The pottery studio felt different now, charged with an energy that hadn't been present before the confrontation. Maya looked down at her abandoned pottery wheel where the clay had continued spinning unattended, maintaining its shape through the entire incident as if waiting for her return. She sat back down at her station, placing her hands on the clay once again, and immediately felt the same tingling sensation that had preceded her unexpected strength. The clay responded to her touch differently than it had before, seeming more malleable and cooperative under her enhanced control. Maya found that she could shape it with greater precision than ever before, her improved fine motor control allowing her to achieve effects that had previously required multiple attempts and careful adjustment. The enhanced tactile sensitivity that had helped her modulate her grip strength during the confrontation now translated into improved artistic capability. Maya realized that she'd discovered something about herself that night, something that had been dormant until circumstances forced it to surface. The quiet strength she'd always possessed had deeper sources than she'd understood, capabilities that extended far beyond what she'd previously imagined possible. Maya had spent her entire life believing she was weak, vulnerable, dependent on others for protection from a world that seemed designed to exploit gentleness. But tonight had proven that assumption wrong in ways that would require her to reconsider everything she'd believed about herself and her place in the world. Maya Chun was not the helpless victim that bullies expected to find, and anyone who tried to treat her as such would discover that appearances could be devastatingly deceptive. Maya had found her strength, and she was beginning to understand that it was far more formidable than anyone, including herself, had ever suspected. As Maya shaped the clay between her hands, feeling the familiar piece of creative work combined with the new awareness of her hidden capabilities, she began to understand that her life had fundamentally changed. She was no longer the invisible girl who hid from conflict and hoped to avoid attention. She was someone with the power to defend herself and others, someone who could stand up to bullies and make them reconsider their assumptions about vulnerability and strength. The implications were enormous, and Maya knew that tonight's confrontation was only the beginning of a journey that would take her far beyond the safety of pottery studios and art classes. She had discovered that she possessed capabilities that others would want to understand, exploit, or eliminate, and that knowledge would force her to make choices about how to use her newfound strength. Maya Chun had been transformed from victim to something else entirely, and the world would never look quite the same way again. The clay in her hand seemed to pulse with the same energy that had awakened during the confrontation, responding to her enhanced control with fluidity that produced shapes more graceful than anything she'd created before. Maya realized that her artistic abilities had been enhanced along with her physical capabilities, suggesting that whatever had changed within her affected multiple aspects of her being rather than just her strength and reflexes. Maya continued working with the clay as she processed the night's events, her enhanced focus allowing her to maintain perfect control over the pottery wheel while her mind grappled with the implications of her transformation. She understood that she would need to learn more about these new capabilities to understand their limits and origins before she could decide how to integrate them into her life. The quiet sanctuary of the pottery studio would help her think through these challenges, but Maya knew that her days of invisibility and passive avoidance were over. The future stretched before Maya with possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. Paths that required strength and confidence she was only beginning to discover. Whatever force had awakened within her tonight represented not just protection from future threats, but potential for achievements and contributions she'd never considered possible. Maya Sheen was beginning a new chapter of her life, one that would require her to redefine not just her own identity, but her understanding of what it meant to have power in a world that often rewarded aggression over gentleness. As the evening progressed and Maya continued her pottery work with enhanced skill and focus, she began to feel a sense of anticipation rather than anxiety about what lay ahead. She had discovered that she was capable of protecting herself and potentially others, that her gentleness could coexist with strength in ways that made both more powerful. Maya Shen was no longer afraid of the future, because she was beginning to understand that she had the power to shape it according to her own vision rather than accepting whatever circumstances others chose to impose upon her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.